This is the smallest scale miniature I've ever painted. Hey everyone, you're watching Squidmar Miniatures, I'm Emil. And to take our mind off all of the craziness that's going on in the world today I'm going to paint a miniature from this week's sponsor, Starlight the board game. It's a miniature based board game that's currently being run as a Kickstarter. They already smashed their goals tenfold, and it's looking quite exciting if you ask me. Starlight is a narrative, solo or cooperative game set in the Draconian system. You are close to completing your training as a pilot when an unknown enemy attacks and destroys your home planet. Starlight is a game that can be replayed many times as the narrative system branches out, so every gameplay will be different and give a different gaming experience. In the core box you have 4 starships, 4 dual layered playing boards, 650 plus cards, 80 plus pages of scenarios and 30 plus enemies. And guys, that's just some of the cool things that you get if you pledge on the Kickstarter right now, so you can follow the link in the video description if you want to know more. Enough talk about sponsors, let's get on with the painting. My idea with painting this tiny spaceship is to follow the concept art as close as possible. We still want it to look good in not just one dimension but all 3 dimensions, so I will have to adapt and make some adjustments to where I place the highlights and things like that. But the colors we're going to try to keep as close as possible. And I also want to keep those stylized kind of cartoony looks to the miniatures as well. I have 3 tools that I'm using when painting this, 4 if you count in the colors as well. But the first one is a Kolinsky Sable brush. And because of the size of these miniatures, we need a brush that has a really good tip. Any Kolinsky Sable brush tends to be fine. The specific one I'm using for this one is my Squidmar miniature brushes. These ones are yet to be released. They will be released in a few weeks. If you want to know more, you can follow the link to my website and sign up to the newsletter. But I'm using a size M and a size L for this. The reason why we need a good tip is quite obvious, because any mistake we make will be very visible, so if we don't have a good tip, it will be very hard to control where the paint goes. And the second and third things that I'm using is a wet palette and a cup of water to clean the brush. If you don't know what a wet palette is, it's sort of a palette that keeps the paints moist and wet during the time that I paint. I have made 2 videos talking about this subject and what you need to get started with miniature painting. I will put those in the video description as well as up in this corner right now. So you can follow those links if you want to know more. As for the water cup, it's quite simple. The only thing you don't get to do, that I know I did when I started painting, was to leave my brushes upside down in the cup of water. This will kill your brush tip and it will be very hard for you to get the control that you want from your paint. Before we add paint to the brush, we need to make sure that the bristles, the hair of the brush, are moist. The easiest way to do this is quite obvious. You stir it around in the water, and as you might see, now that I remove it, I have too much water in my brush. If I now add the paint to the brush, the water will be so watered down that it won't cover any part of the miniature. It will be like a transparent goo on the miniature. So what I do before I start painting is to wick off the excess, either by drawing it on my palm, on the hand, or on a piece of paper, for example. You still want to keep moist in the brush before you start painting, but not too much. And now that you started adding some paint to the brush, it's important as well that you mix in the paint into the brush bristles. You don't want to take that goop of paint and place it on the miniature, because you will leave brush marks and different things on the miniature. So you want to make sure that you stir it into the brush before we start adding it to the miniature. I start off by painting the miniature in a sort of mustard yellow tone. For this specific one, I'm using the Citadel color Averland Sunset. And when painting something this small scale, it's quite important that you don't add too thick layers of paint on it. And that's the reason why we started with filling the brush with a little bit of moist water and then just loading the brush with a little bit of the paint. This might cause you to have to paint the yellow 2 layers to get a full coverage. The same probably with all of the colors we're going to use today, but for this specific case I think it makes more sense to have 2 thin coats to get a full coverage rather than 1 thick that I tend to use on the bigger models. And I want to keep that cell shading look that the concept art for Starlight had, so I paint the colors in different blocks of colors. So on the side here of the ship, for example, I'm shading it using Mournfang brown, and on the darkest, deepest areas I'm using black paint. And on the front parts here I'm using Vallejo red. And when getting started in painting miniatures, maybe you bought your first gaming set, you don't need to pick up a big set of 120 paints. You can easily mix your paints on your own on, for example, a wet palette like I'm using today. So with the windows of this spaceship, I wanted to have the same blue tone as they have in the concept art. I have a color called Citadel Lothern blue, and it's good as a kind of final highlight, but it was a bit too bright for the midtones. So to paint the first layers of midtones, I just added a few drops of black into my blues, and all of a sudden I have the midtone that's a bit more grey blue than the Lothern blue bottle is originally. And one thing that I found while painting these miniatures from Starlight is that the smaller the scale is, the more important the separation and black lining is. Because if I don't separate the different layers, they are going to feel like they're blended together because they are on such small surfaces. So in this case, for example, I'm using a raw black for a lot of the panels. I won't highlight this black, I will just use a black to create stark contrasts and separations between the different colors. So I just had a little bit of an accident happen because the miniatures that I am sent to paint for this video is not like the finished casted models, but it's actually a 3D printed resin copy. And 3D printed resin copies are super brittle, and I accidentally dropped it on the ground and the two front parts of the miniature just fell off. So I'm going to have to glue it back together. It's probably going to leave some marks, but let's see if we can hide it. So with a little bit of love and super glue, the pieces are back together, but as you can see, there's a small line going across there. It's like a seam line. It's inevitable, but I think we can hide it using some paints and some tricks. The spaceship right now is very yellow, and we want to create some separation between these different yellow parts. And one of the things that I'm doing on the sides of these different planes on the ship is to add a mix of that yellow Averland sunset and the brown that's called Mournfang brown. When I mix that about 2 parts yellow and 1 part brown, I get a really nice mustardy brown on the sides that works very well as a shadow. And on top of that, I'm just adding more black to the different panels once again to make some large separation and give that nice contrast to the miniature. As on the concept art, I wanted to add a little bit of orange to these red parts in the front. This again is to create some separation between the different planes of light. The parts that are angled downwards, I want to have them a little bit darker, so they will be red, and then the top part will be orange. And orange is one of these paints that have a really low pigmentation, so to get that vibrant orange and to not have to paint 30 different layers of orange, I first pre-paint them with a white paint. This is just like a base coat to then later, when I add orange, get the true orange tones shining through. And painting miniatures is somewhat of an organic process, and in this specific case with these small squares in the front parts here of the ship, I wanted to make them brighter. So I mixed a little bit of white into my yellows to see if that would make a nice pop to these small pieces. But you will also see in the end that I wasn't really happy with this, so I just changed the color later. And you don't have to be afraid of making mistakes, because it's just paint and it's super easy to just change as we go. And now it's time to fix those broken wings and cover up that seam on the miniature that was broken. And I start with using that mix of 1 part Mournfang brown and 2 parts of the yellow to create a line that goes on the opposite direction of this broken part. And now it's adding orange time, and you will just see me add 1 layer here, but in reality I actually added 2 layers of orange to get a full nice coverage, even though I had white underneath it. So just imagine how many layers I would have taken if I had the darker red underneath. And you've seen that I painted some of the parts of the ship in a full Mournfang brown. Again, it creates a great variation to the ship and adds nice color contrast to it. But this brown felt a bit too uniform, so on some of the angled parts I added a brighter brown. For this I used a color called Deathclaw brown, but if you don't have a lot of colors, you don't have to buy this specifically for just one small part. Adding a few drops of white, or maybe a little bit of white and yellow to the brown, will give you the same sort of tonal variation. You don't need to buy 100 paints for painting your first miniatures. And now you will see me start adding highlights to the miniature. I will do this sort of organically. I will not focus on one part, and that's kind of the way that I paint today. I go back and forth between different parts. And the simplest way of doing this to get a brighter tone is obviously just mixing in some white to your mid-tones. So on these front parts, for example, I just draw a line on one of the sides using an orange with a little bit of white to it. On the top parts of the spaceship, I will add a little bit of white to my yellow tones. Again, this will add more life to it, will create a good variation and create somewhat of a 3D feel to the miniature. And the yellow that I'm using for these parts is called Sun Yellow. It's from a brand called Vallejo. And then, as I said, for the parts that I want to make even brighter, I'm adding a few drops of white into it. And now let's talk about one of the things that brings the whole piece together the most, and that is creating lines between all of these different panels. The smaller the scale is, the more difficult it is to separate the different parts. Again, we talked about this earlier, but when I start adding these different brown lines, for the yellow, for example, I'm using Mournfang brown as a line between the different parts, and for the brown parts I'm using a clean black to create separation. And when I added this, something just brings everything together. It starts looking more like a real-life thing rather than different parts on a small toy painted. And now we reach to a point with the miniature where I feel like it's getting close to done. And it's important to take a step back now and analyze what you've done so far and kind of look at where you can improve your miniatures. In this specific case, I found that a lot of different parts needed more highlighting. So I started by highlighting the window and some of the black line parts on the top. I wanted to make them look a little bit more like metal, so I added like a gray center highlight on the top parts here. And these squares in the front as well, I mentioned, I felt like they were a bit flat, so I added a little bit of a brighter whitish yellow, more like a cream yellow. And then adding even more of that lines, the brown lines, to separate these squares in the front as well. And it's very important to use a good brush when painting these lines. A good brush with a good tip is super important. That's what helped me to create these fine lines. Cheaper ones tend to not have as good tip and not to hold the paint as well as this does. And as a final highlight, I added a bigger flat surface of a brighter yellow to the top of the spaceship to just tie everything together a bit more and create even more of that 3D feel. And the last and final part that I painted on the miniature was that seam line that was created after I broke the miniature and glued it back together. I just used that Mournfang brown again and painted a fine brown line across the whole seam, and now it's gone. You can't see it anymore. So it was quite interesting to paint a miniature of this super small scale. I have no idea how small this is, but I'm guessing it's like 1/500th of scale or something. So 500 centimeters would be like 1 centimeter, or maybe 1/300. I don't know. If anyone knows, let me know in the comment section. But it was a different experience, and the thing that I found was most kind of exciting was that every mistake that I did just was super visible. So it was very important for me to be super steady. I was leaning towards the table pretty much the whole time, having my palms against each other like this, and the hand was like on the bottom part of the brush, so I got the most control possible to not lose control of it and have the paint go on places where I didn't want it to go. So guys, don't forget to check out this week's sponsor, Starlight. As I mentioned in the video description down below, I have the links. If you like this video, leave a like. That really helps the video spread out to new people. If you like hobby videos in general, I release new videos every week about hobby, miniature painting, or whatever that has to do with miniatures and Warhammer and stuff like that. And if you want to support this channel, there's a couple of ways you can do that. The first one is by joining my Patreon family. There's today about 300 people that support me, and on top of making sure that I can run this channel, you get to join my Patreon exclusive Discord channel where we chat every day about life and miniature painting and just having fun. A massive shout out to my top Patreon supporters, Albin Åström, Daniel Santos, Russ Prentice, Jess Goldswain, and Robin Svensson. You guys are the best. And if you're interested in any of the gear or tools that I use in all of my videos, I have them all listed on my website, squidmar.com. Under all of those articles and products that I've listed, I added links to Amazon, and if you follow any one of those, on top of you getting the stuff that you need, Amazon kicks a little bit of money back to this channel, and that's a great way that I can keep running this channel and making these videos. So with that said, guys, I hope you have a great day. Stay safe. Bye.